I mean, the Ryder Cup was incredible. I've never seen a golf environment like that. You know, it's so competitive. People were chanting. So it was cool. And I think meeting Michael Jordan is just, I mean, that's my GOAT. That's somebody I've always seen as a GOAT in my household. So I think it was a dream come true, but it was just really cool that he was able to take the time and to be able to meet him.
What if the next American basketball superstar is already being set up to fail before he even plays a single NBA game? Because Cooper Flagg is not just the most hyped high school player in years. He might be the most dangerous type of prospect the system has ever created, one that everyone agrees is special. But no one agrees on what he actually is. Some people say he is the safest #1 pick since LeBron. Others say he is just another overhyped white prospect benefiting from viral clips and media obsession. And that gap between expectation and reality, that is where careers collapse. And if you think this is just another high school phenom story, it is not. Because the pressure around Cooper Flagg is already bigger than most NBA players will ever experience. And if you want to see how hype can build a superstar and destroy one at the same time, stick around, because this story gets uncomfortable fast. Cooper Flagg should not be this controversial. On paper, he is exactly what modern basketball is supposed to look like. 6'8", elite defensive instincts, shot blocking from the weak side, guard skills, passing vision, high motor, high IQ. He checks every single box that scouts claim they want, and the numbers support it. At Montverde Academy, one of the most stacked high school programs in America, Flagg was not just good, he was dominant in ways that do not show up in simple scoring stats. He impacted games defensively, he rotated early, he erased mistakes. He played like someone who understood the game 2 steps ahead. And that is where the first problem starts, because dominance without a clear identity creates confusion, and confusion creates debate. Is he a future #1 scoring option, or just an elite role player with star hype? Is he Kevin Durant, or is he Andrei Kirilenko with better marketing? That debate should not exist this early, but it does. And the reason is not just his game, it is the environment around him. Flagg is coming up in an era where social media clips matter almost as much as actual production. Every block becomes a viral moment, every dunk becomes a statement. Every game gets dissected before it even ends. And that creates a version of reality that is hard to escape. Because in highlights, Cooper Flagg looks unstoppable. He looks like a defensive monster who can also handle the ball and shoot over defenders. He looks like a future franchise player, but in full games, the picture gets more complicated. There are stretches where he defers too much, moments where he disappears offensively, sequences where he looks like he is trying to fit into a system instead of taking it over, and that difference between highlight dominance and full game control. That is where the real tension begins. Because NBA teams are not drafting highlights. They are drafting responsibility. And right now, nobody knows exactly how much responsibility Cooper Flagg can carry. That uncertainty would already be enough pressure. But that is not the real issue. The real issue is timing. Because Cooper Flagg is not entering a neutral draft class. He is entering one where he is expected to be the face, the savior, the next American superstar in a league that is increasingly dominated by international players. That expectation changes everything. Now he is not just being evaluated as a prospect. He is being evaluated as a symbol of whether American basketball can still produce a generational player, a symbol of whether hype culture actually identifies real greatness, a symbol of whether the next face of the league will be built or manufactured. And symbols do not get patience, they get judged immediately, which means every game he plays is not just a performance, it is evidence. Every good game reinforces the hype. Every quiet game fuels the doubt. And the media is already picking sides. Some analysts are calling him the most complete young player in years. Others are quietly questioning whether his offensive ceiling is being exaggerated. And that split narrative is dangerous, because once a player becomes polarizing this early, every moment starts to get framed as confirmation of one side or the other. There's no neutral ground anymore, only belief or skepticism. And that kind of pressure does not wait until the NBA. It starts now. And just when it looked like Cooper Flagg was about to separate himself from every other prospect in his class, something happened that completely changed how people started to see him. And that was only the beginning. The moment that was supposed to confirm everything started raising questions instead. Team USA did not invite Cooper Flagg just to participate. They threw him into a roster filled with older players, stronger players, more experienced players, and instead of looking like a kid trying to survive, he looked like he belonged. In scrimmages against Team USA Select, reports came out that Flagg was not just holding his own. He was making plays, blocking shots, switching onto guards, finishing through contact. There were sequences where he looked like one of the most impactful players on the floor. Headlines started shifting. Now it was not just hype, it was validation. A high school player competing against near professional level talent and not breaking. That is rare. That is supposed to be the moment where doubt disappears. Except it did not. Because the same reports that praised his defense quietly revealed something else. He was not taking over offensively. He was not demanding the ball. He was not bending the defense. He was not creating the kind of scoring pressure that separates stars from elite role players, and that changed the conversation completely. Now the question was not whether Cooper Flagg was good. That was already answered. The question became something much more uncomfortable. Can he actually be the guy? Because history is full of players who looked incredible next to stars, who made winning plays, who filled gaps, who impacted games without dominating them. But the NBA does not build around those players. It builds around players who force the game to revolve around them, and in those high-level environments. Flagg looked more like a connector than a controller. That does not mean he cannot become a star, but it introduces doubt, and doubt at the top of the draft is dangerous, because the higher the expectation, the less room there is for uncertainty. And just when people started adjusting their expectations, trying to redefine what kind of player he might become, another layer of pressure hit him, and this one had nothing to do with basketball. The hype did not slow down, it exploded. Cooper Flagg was not just trending inside basketball circles anymore. He was becoming a mainstream storyline. Sports shows, social media debates, highlight pages, everyone was talking about him, and with that level of attention comes something even more volatile than expectation. Narrative. Suddenly, every detail about him mattered more than it should. The fact that he was from Maine, a state not known for producing NBA stars, became part of the story. The fact that he dominated early became part of the story. The fact that he looked fundamentally sound instead of flashy became part of the story. And then the comparisons started. Not just realistic comparisons, extreme ones. Some people started throwing out names like Kevin Garnett because of his defensive instincts and intensity. Others compared his versatility to players like Scottie Pippen. But there was another side, a louder, more skeptical side. People started questioning whether the hype was being pushed too hard, too early, too aggressively. They pointed at the lack of elite shot creation. They pointed at stretches where he blended into the system instead of controlling it. They pointed at the history of prospects who were labeled safe but never became superstars. And then came the most uncomfortable layer of all, the conversation that no one says directly, but everyone understands. Why is he getting this much attention? Is it purely basketball? Or is there something else driving it? And once that question enters the narrative, it does not leave. Because now every performance is not just evaluated on what he does, it is evaluated on whether he deserves the spotlight. And that raises the stakes in a completely different way. Now he is not just trying to prove he is good enough, he is trying to prove the hype is justified. And those are two very different battles, because one is about development, the other is about perception. And perception moves faster than reality. Which means if he has one quiet game, one average stretch, one moment where he does not look dominant, it gets amplified, it gets clipped, it gets debated, and it spreads. That kind of environment does not wait for players to grow. It demands answers immediately, and for Cooper Flagg, that pressure arrived before he even finished high school. But the real problem was not the criticism, it was what happened when he actually tried to answer it. Because just when it looked like he was ready to prove he could take over games, that he could silence the doubt, he delivered a performance that should have ended the debate, and somehow made it worse. The breakout game was supposed to end the argument. Instead, it split it in half. There was a stretch where Cooper Flagg looked exactly like the player everyone was projecting. Aggressive, decisive, scoring through contact, hitting shots, attacking mismatches, playing with a level of control that finally made him look like the center of everything. This was not the passive version people questioned. This was a player demanding the game. And the numbers backed it up. High scoring, efficient shooting, defensive impact still elite. He was everywhere, on both ends, making plays that looked like they belonged to a future NBA star. Clips went viral immediately. Analysts reacted fast. This is why he is number one. This is the ceiling everyone is talking about. This is the guy. For a moment, the debate felt over. Because when a player shows that version of himself, it answers the biggest question. Can he take over? Yes. But that was only part of the story. Because when you zoomed out, something did not line up. That level of aggression, that level of offensive control. It was not consistent. It came in flashes, and that creates a different kind of problem. Because flashes prove ability, but inconsistency raises concern. If he can do it, why does he not do it all the time? Is it decision-making? Is it mindset? Is it role? Or is it something deeper? And that question started getting louder, because now the conversation was no longer about whether he has star potential. It was about whether he has star mentality. And those are not the same thing. Plenty of players have the skill to dominate. Far fewer choose to impose it every night. And that distinction is what separates stars from franchise players. So now the narrative shifted again. Not hype versus doubt, but ceiling versus consistency. And that is a much harder conversation to win. Because you cannot solve it with one great game. You have to solve it over time. And time is the one thing hype does not allow. Because while people were celebrating his breakout, another reality was forming underneath it. One that made everything more complicated. And more dangerous, the better he played, The higher the expectations climbed, and eventually, the expectations stopped matching reality. Because now Cooper Flagg was not just being evaluated as a top prospect. He was being evaluated as the future face of American basketball. That is not development pressure, that is identity pressure. And you could start to see it in how games were being analyzed. A solid performance was no longer enough. A good game was treated like a disappointment. Anything short of dominance became a talking point. That is not normal for a player his age, and it started affecting the narrative in real time. Because every time he played within the flow, people questioned his aggression. Every time he deferred, people questioned his mentality. Every time he focused on defense, people asked why he was not scoring more. The same versatility that made him special became a reason to criticize him, because now he was being judged against an unrealistic version of himself. And that creates a trap, because if he forces offense, he risks losing efficiency. If he plays team basketball, he risks being called passive. There is no clean answer, only trade-offs. And that is where pressure starts turning into tension, because now every decision he makes on the court has a narrative attached to it, and that narrative moves faster than his development, which means he is constantly being evaluated for what he is not yet, instead of what he already is. And that is how expectations start distorting reality, because the question is no longer, how good is Cooper Flagg? The question becomes, why is he not dominating every game? And that is a completely different standard, one that very few players can meet, especially this early. And if you are still watching at this point, you are starting to see the real issue. This is not just about talent, it is about timing, perception, and pressure colliding all at once. So if you want to understand whether Cooper Flagg is actually built to handle this, or if this hype cycle is setting him up for something much worse, make sure you stay with this. Because what happens next is where the story stops being about potential and starts becoming about consequences. The media did not wait for answers. They picked sides, and once that happened, Cooper Flagg was no longer just a prospect. He became a debate on one side. Analysts doubled down. They pointed to his versatility, his defensive instincts, his feel for the game. They argued that he impacts winning in ways that go beyond scoring, that he does things most players his age cannot even process. They called him complete, but the other side kept getting louder. They started breaking down film differently, slowing possessions down, highlighting moments where he passed up shots, where he drifted on offense, where he did not assert control. And then came the comparisons again. Not to superstars this time, to players who were valuable, but not franchise defining. That shift changed everything. Because now the conversation was not just about what he could become, it was about what he might never become. And that creates a very specific kind of pressure. Because when the narrative splits like that, every performance becomes evidence. If he dominates, it proves the believers right. If he hesitates, it validates the skeptics. There is no middle ground anymore. And the timing made it worse, because this was happening while he was still developing, still figuring out his game, still adjusting to higher levels of competition. But the expectations did not adjust with him. They accelerated, and the reactions became immediate. A strong defensive game was praised, but followed by criticism about scoring. A high-scoring game was praised, but followed by questions about efficiency or consistency. There was always something missing, and that constant shifting of expectations creates instability, because the target keeps moving, and when the target keeps moving, players start chasing it, not playing their game, trying to prove something, and that is when mistakes start happening. Because forcing growth rarely leads to real development. It leads to breakdowns. And the first real signs of that started to show. Not in highlights, but in moments people usually ignore. Missed reads, forced shots, slight hesitation, small frustrations that build over time, nothing dramatic, but enough to suggest something was changing, because now he was not just playing to win, he was playing to respond. And that is a dangerous shift, because the more you try to answer the narrative, the more the narrative controls you. And that is when everything started getting unstable. But what made it worse was not the criticism. It was what happened when the pressure finally hit a breaking point. There's always a moment where pressure stops being external and becomes internal. For Cooper Flagg, that moment did not come from one big failure. It came from accumulation, game after game, expectation after expectation, reaction after reaction, until something started to crack. The performances were still good, but they were no longer clean. You could see it in the decisions. Instead of reacting naturally, he started thinking. Instead of controlling the flow, he started forcing it, trying to prove he could be the scorer, trying to silence the questions. And that is where efficiency drops. Because forced offense looks different, it is slightly rushed, slightly off rhythm, slightly predictable. Defenders adjust, and suddenly, the same player who looked effortless before starts looking pressured, and the numbers reflect it. Shooting dips in certain stretches. Turnovers increase in key moments. The impact is still there, but it is less consistent, and consistency is everything at the top. Because when you are projected as number one, there is no margin for visible struggle, and the reactions were immediate. clips started circulating, not of his highlights, but of his misses, missed jumpers, missed reads, moments where he looked human. And those clips spread fast, because doubt spreads faster than hype. And now the narrative flipped again, not just questioning his ceiling, questioning his readiness. Is he actually ready to be the face? Is he actually ready to carry that level of expectation? And once those questions become public, they do not go away, they evolve. Because now it is not just about his game. It is about how he responds to pressure, and that is something you cannot fake. You either handle it, or it exposes you, and for the first time. There were real signs that the pressure was affecting him. Not enough to collapse, but enough to raise concern. And that changed the entire trajectory of the story. Because now the question was no longer about potential, it was about resilience, and whether he could reset before the narrative locked in. Because once a player gets labeled early, it sticks. And just when it looked like things might stabilize, that he might adjust, slow the game down, find his rhythm again, another challenge appeared, one that would force him to make a choice. Play safe or take control, and that decision would define everything that came next. At some point, every elite prospect faces the same decision: stay safe or take over. And Cooper Flagg finally made his choice. You could see it in the way he started approaching games again. The hesitation began to fade. The decision-making became quicker. The aggression came back, not forced this time, but intentional. He started attacking earlier in possessions, calling for the ball more, initiating actions instead of reacting to them. And the results showed immediately: more scoring, more pressure on defenses, more moments where he looked like the center of everything instead of a piece within it. This was the adjustment people were waiting for. Proof that he could respond. Proof that he could evolve. Proof that the earlier struggles were not limitations, just part of the process. And for a moment, it worked. The narrative softened. Criticism slowed down. Clips started trending again, but now they were different. More control, more confidence, more ownership of the game. It felt like a reset, like he had figured it out. Except there was a cost. Because when a player shifts from natural flow to intentional dominance, it changes the balance of their game. The same aggression that creates offense can take away from other areas. And slowly, that trade-off started to appear. The defensive impact was still there, but not always at the same level. The off-ball reads were slightly delayed. The rotations were not as sharp in every sequence. Nothing drastic, but noticeable. Because now he was carrying more responsibility on offense. And that creates fatigue, not just physical, mental. Because now every possession runs through you. Every decision matters more. Every mistake feels heavier. And that weight does not disappear. It accumulates. So while he was proving he could take over, he was also entering a different kind of pressure. The pressure of sustaining it. That is where many players struggle. Because taking control for a stretch is one thing. Doing it consistently, against better competition, with higher expectations, that is a completely different level. And the moment you show you can do it, people expect you to do it every time. Which means the standard rises again. And this time, there is no going back, because now the question is no longer, can he do it? It becomes, why is he not doing it every night? And that is a much harder question to answer, because now you are being judged at your ceiling, not your development stage, and that changed everything again. Because the story was no longer about whether he could become great. It became about whether he could live up to what he had already shown, and that is where the pressure becomes permanent. At this point, the story stopped being about basketball. It became about identity. Because Cooper Flagg was no longer just a player developing his game. He was becoming a projection of what people want the future of American basketball to look like. And that comes with expectations that go beyond performance. Now it is about style, about dominance, about whether he looks like a number one option, not just whether he plays like a winning player. And those two things do not always align. Because winning players adapt, they adjust, they play within systems. But stars, they bend the system. And the tension between those two roles is now at the center of his story. Because when he plays the right way, he gets called passive. When he forces the issue, he gets called inconsistent. There is no perfect version, only different criticisms. And that creates a long-term question, not about his talent, but about his path. What kind of player is he supposed to become? Because if he leans fully into scoring, he risks losing what makes him special. If he stays balanced, he risks never meeting the expectations placed on him. And that is the paradox. The same versatility that made him the top prospect is now the reason people cannot agree on what he should be. And that uncertainty affects everything. Draft conversations, team fits, future projections. Because teams are not just drafting what a player is, they are drafting what they believe he will become. And when that vision is unclear, it creates hesitation, not enough to drop him, but enough to change how he is perceived. From guaranteed superstar to complicated investment, and that shift is subtle, but important, because it changes the tone from certainty to evaluation, and once that happens, the pressure does not decrease, it sharpens. Because now every performance is not just about proving he is good. It is about proving he is worth building around. And that is the hardest role in basketball. because you are no longer judged by moments. You are judged by direction, and direction takes time. But expectations do not wait. So now the question is bigger than any single game, bigger than any stat line. It is about whether Cooper Flagg is becoming the player people imagined, or something completely different. And the answer to that question will define not just his career, but how this entire era of hype gets remembered. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Cooper Flagg might already be too big to develop normally, not because of his game, but because of what has been built around him. Because at this point, every version of him comes with a consequence. If he becomes a dominant scorer, people will ask why it took so long. If he stays a versatile two-way player, people will say he never became the guy. If he wins without putting up huge numbers, people will question his star power. If he chases numbers, people will question his impact. There is no clean outcome anymore, only different narratives, and that is what makes this situation dangerous. Because development requires space, space to fail, space to experiment, space to evolve without being judged at every step. But Cooper Flagg does not have that space. He is being evaluated in real time, compared in real time, projected in real time. And that compresses everything. Every good stretch feels like confirmation. Every bad stretch feels like exposure. And over time, that affects how a player grows. Because instead of building a foundation, you start reacting, adjusting to noise instead of refining identity. And that is how careers get redirected, not destroyed, but reshaped into something different than they were supposed to be. And here is where the story becomes bigger than him, because Cooper Flagg is not just a prospect. He is a test of whether the system that creates hype can also support development, a test of whether a player can survive being defined before he is finished growing, a test of whether expectations can be managed once they reach this level. Because we have seen this before, players who were labeled early, players who were projected as the future, players who entered the league with narratives already attached. Some lived up to it, some never escaped it. And the difference was not always talent. It was timing, environment, fit, and how much room they had to become themselves. So the real question is not whether Cooper Flagg is good enough. He clearly is. The real question is whether the version of him people are expecting is actually the version he is supposed to become. Because if those two things do not align, then no matter how good he is, it will feel like something is missing. And that is how perception reshapes reality. Because in the NBA, being great is not always enough. You have to be great in the way people expect, or the narrative never fully turns in your favor. And that is the pressure waiting for him. Not just to succeed, but to succeed correctly. And that is a much harder task, because it requires not just skill, but control over how your story unfolds. And that is something no young player truly has. Which means the next phase of Cooper Flagg's career will not just be about performance. It will be about resistance. Resistance to expectation, resistance to narrative, resistance to becoming something he is not. Because if he can hold on to what makes him unique, while still expanding his game, then maybe he does not become what people expected. He becomes something better. But if the pressure keeps shaping his decisions, if the narrative keeps forcing adjustments, if the expectations keep accelerating faster than his development, then this story does not end with a clear failure. It ends with something more complicated. A player who was always great, but never quite what people wanted him to be. And that is the risk no one talks about. Not that Cooper Flagg will fail, but that he might succeed. And it still will not be enough. So the question is no longer, will he become a star? It is this. Will he get the chance to become himself before the narrative decides who he is? And if you care about where basketball is going next, that question matters more than anything else. So if you want more stories that break down the reality behind the hype, not just what players are, but what they are forced to become, make sure you stay locked in here. Because the next superstar story might already be following the same path,